has given the most remarkable, devoted service to the Queen, to my family, and to the country, and also to the whole of the Commonwealth.
The deep humiliation of the British monarch did not unfold with explosive public scenes, dramatic shouting matches, or loud television confrontations. Instead, it arrived with a devastating quietness, delivered through a sealed legal document that moved through the historic corridors of Windsor Castle with the solemn and heavy weight of a funeral bell. King Charles read the official court ruling in total silence, his eyes repeatedly stopping at the stark words written next to his wife's name. Camila's legal standing had been completely stripped down to a definitive phrase that altered everything inside the royal household. The court ruled she had zero claim to the highly guarded Windsor Private Wing. It was not a temporary reduction of her access, nor was it a delayed recognition of her royal position, and it certainly was not an invitation to renegotiate terms at a later date. It was an absolute zero. Before we look deeper into how this shocking legal defeat reshapes the entire future of the British monarchy, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a single update regarding the royal family's hidden battles. Charles held the heavy legal pages in his hands, as if the paper itself had grown physically heavier under the burden of defeat. Throughout his long life, the king had faced immense grief, family rebellions, global scandals, and painful emotional distance, but the specific blow struck somewhere much colder and more permanent. To fully understand the magnitude of this event, we must realize that a court ruling means an official legal decision made after reviewing historical records, legal claims, and constitutional authority. This particular judicial decision stated with absolute clarity that Camila possessed no legal or ceremonial claim to the Windsor Private Wing. A ceremonial claim refers to the formal recognition of a person's rights through custom, royal protocol, or established monarchical traditions. The Windsor Private Wing was never just a collection of beautifully decorated historical rooms. It represented the protected heart of the castle, where family memories carried almost as much political power as the crown itself. Camila stood quietly near the heavy wooden doorway, watching the expressions change on her husband's face. She did not need Charles to read the final paragraph of the document aloud to her. She saw defeat settle over him before a single word could escape his lips. The Queen Consort had genuinely believed that their marriage, the historic coronation, and decades of public endurance had finally moved her beyond the painful barriers of the past. Yet, this ruling cut through all that built-up security. She was not being asked to wait. She was not being delayed. She was being firmly told that the door had never belonged to her. Charles read the final paragraph once more, then placed the papers on the table with such immense, quiet control that the silence in the room became completely unbearable. The reigning monarch could open parliament. He could receive foreign prime ministers. He could stand before a cheering nation, but inside this private corner of Windsor, he could not override the written words in front of him. That was why the humiliation burned so deeply. The ruling did not only limit his wife, it exposed the structural limits of his own sovereign power. The hidden blow came in a specific clause buried deeply inside the historical Windsor household records. A private household clause means an internal royal instruction controlling the access, use, or protection of specific family spaces. This particular clause linked the wing directly to Queen Elizabeth's final wishes, preserving it as a sacred space of memory rather than a reward of rank. Charles understood at once that someone had protected this boundary long before the courtroom ever spoke, and Camila understood something far worse. Someone inside the royal family had known all along that her claim would completely collapse. As Charles absorbed the words that stripped away his authority, every key person tied to the decision began moving into place for the massive emotional storm that followed. This was never just a minor legal setback. It was deeply personal, reaching into the core of their marriage, memory, loyalty, and the fragile public image Charles had spent years trying to protect. Camila was not simply denied a room. She was denied belonging in one of the monarchy's most private spaces, while Prince William, Princess Anne, and Catherine watched the decision reshape the balance of power inside the family. Charles knew the ruling had done more than close a physical door. It placed him in the cruelest position a king could face, expected to defend his wife in public, yet trapped by rules even his own crown could not erase. Every personal instinct pushed him toward her protection, but every historical record pulled him back toward total surrender. The The Windsor Private Wing had become a test of whether his reign could bend old boundaries or whether old boundaries would ultimately bend him. Camila felt a profound meaning before anyone even explained it to her. For her, access to that wing would have been the ultimate proof that the years of judgment, whispers, and waiting had finally ended. It would have meant total acceptance in the deepest layer of Windsor life, not just polite applause at official ceremonies. But after the announcement, she sat alone with her gloves still in her lap, staring at the closed folder as if it had spoken louder than any family member ever dared. No argument followed. No comfort came fast enough, and the silence told her everything she feared. William did not celebrate. The Prince of Wales felt a quiet resolve, but absolutely no victory. He understood that the ruling protected a royal boundary that had survived marriage, coronation, and intense internal pressure. Yet he also knew it wounded his father in a place no son could easily ignore. The future king had spent years learning that duty often arrives dressed as pain, and now that lesson stood directly in front of him, sharpened by his father's visible humiliation and Camila's deep hurt. Princess Anne's reaction unsettled the room most of all. She did not gasp. She did not demand clarification from the lawyers. The Princess Royal simply asked whether the decision had been formally entered into the permanent household record, and that calm question struck harder than any emotional outrage. Catherine heard it and understood immediately that this was not only about Camila. This was about the late Queen's private line still holding strong after death, still actively shaping Windsor, and firmly refusing to fade away. That was when the unease deepened, because if and was not surprised, then someone had known all along. And if Catherine could read the emotional cost so quickly, this was not a sudden blow but the return of something long buried. Yet the question hanging over Windsor becomes impossible to ignore, forcing us to ask what happened years earlier that made this ruling inevitable. To truly comprehend why Camila's claim fell so completely, the story must return to the hidden moment that set this entire palace crisis into motion. Every royal crisis has a moment people later pretend they did not recognize at the time. For Windsor, it was not a public scandal. It was a private evening behind closed doors when one single conversation changed the future of the castle's most guarded rooms and quietly placed Camila outside a boundary she would not discover until years later. The memory returned now with painful force. Long before the court ruling, the late Queen had already sensed the danger. Elizabeth understood that certain parts of Windsor could not become bargaining pieces in the politics of remarriage, reputation, or rank. To her, the private wing was not a decoration or a reward of rank. It was memory under protection. Camila's question had seemed simple at first during a private inventory review after a tense family memorial dinner. She asked whether the private wing would be modernized under Charles's future household. The words did not sound explosive, but the effect was immediate. An inventory review was a private check of royal rooms, belongings, and household records done to confirm who controlled access. In that moment, Camila had stepped into the most delicate part of Windsor's emotional map. Elizabeth's expression changed. The Queen closed the book slowly, and the room understood that something sacred had been touched. Charles was present but said absolutely nothing, feeling the first fracture opening between his wife's expectations and his mother's final authority. The future king wanted peace, but peace required silence, and silence that night became its own kind of surrender. The order came quietly afterward as Elizabeth instructed that the access terms of the private wing be rewritten, separating it from ordinary household privilege and placing it under legacy protection. Legacy protection meant the space would be guarded by past royal instruction, not future personal preference. And later witnessed the revised instruction being logged, explaining why her calmness after the court ruling felt almost chilling. She had seen the line drawn years before anyone dared challenge it. Now that buried moment had returned with devastating force. Camila had believed the past could be softened by time, but time had only preserved the permanent record. The question she once asked to become the exact reason she lost everything today. And when she finally understood that an old trigger had defeated her present claim, wounded pride turned into something much sharper. The past had finally stepped into the present, and Camila was about to demand from Charles what the court had just told him he could not give. The confrontation inside the private quarters of Windsor Castle did not happen in front of flashing news cameras or under the watchful eyes of the global press. It unfolded precisely where royal anger becomes most dangerous and unpredictable, deep behind a heavy, closed wooden door with absolutely no royal aides or private secretaries present to soften the brutal impact of the spoken words. Camila faced Charles not with the formal dignity of a queen consort, nor as a carefully polished public figure handling a minor administrative dispute, but as a deeply wounded wife demanding to know why it allowed the very fabric of Windsor to reject her presence so completely. Camila did not begin this intense discussion with tears or visible emotional breakdown. Instead, she began with an icy, terrifying sense of total control, and that cold, deliberate approach made the entire situation even more dangerous for fragile peace of the royal household. The Queen Consort wanted exactly one clear answer from Charles, not a grand political speech, not a soft word of personal comfort, and certainly not another carefully crafted royal phrase wrapped around immense personal pain. She demanded to know with absolute certainty whether he had been aware of the existence of the old access clause before the court ruling finally made it impossible for them to ignore. To fully comprehend the weight of this bitter argument, we must define that an access clause was a formal, written internal rule controlling precisely who could enter, occupy, or claim the daily use of specific royal space. In this tragic instance, that hidden clause had effectively become the permanent legal sentence that separated her from the Windsor Private Wing forever. Charles heard the sharp, direct question from his wife and hesitated for a short duration. It was only a single second of hesitation, but that brief silence wounded her far more deeply than any verbal denial could have ever achieved. The king had survived decades of immense public storms and media scrutiny by mastering the art of diplomatic silence. Yet that same silence now completely betrayed him in his own home. Camila saw the truth written across his face immediately. He had not been entirely blind to what was happening behind the scenes. Perhaps he had not known every microscopic detail of the legal mechanics, or perhaps he had simply hoped the buried past would stay safely beneath the surface. But a sudden pause told her everything she needed to know. The ancient resistance of Windsor had not shocked him nearly as deeply as it had shocked her. Charles rose slowly from his plush chair, as if the physical movement might give him some sudden burst of sovereign strength. But then he sat down again in resignation. That small, physical defeat exposed the harsh reality of his modern kingship. He could love her with all his heart. He could defend her honor before massive crowds. He could place her directly beside him at grand state ceremonies. And he could proudly call her his irreplaceable partner in duty, but he could not magically turn that personal love into absolute institutional authority. He could not command the ancient walls of the Windsor Private Wing to accept her presence when the historical household records had already firmly refused the authority of the crown in that specific room. The golden crown in that quiet room felt suddenly much smaller than a heavy closed door it simply could not open. Camila pressed her husband even harder, refusing to let the matter rest, and asked who else among the family had known about this hidden trap. Charles tried his best to soften the blow of the answer, but the devastating truth arrived anyway. Princess had been fully aware of the protected clause years before the bitter court battle ever reached its final public stage. This revelation struck Camila like cold iron against her chest. The Princess Royal had not looked calm during the family meetings because she lacked emotional feeling. She had looked calm because she had already seen the iron line drawn, officially signed, and permanently preserved in the archives. Then Charles gave the painful admission that Camila feared most of all. The court ruling could not be appealed by the crown without exposing far more private Windsor instructions to intense public scrutiny and legal analysis. A formal appeal would not simply challenge a decision about a set of rooms. It would drag the late Queen Elizabeth's most guarded, personal wishes into the open court and turn sacred family memory into a national political argument. Camila understood completely in that dark moment that Charles was not choosing total surrender because he lacked personal loyalty to her. He was surrendering because continuing to fight this institutional battle would make the wound significantly wider and more destructive. What had initially begun as a tense marital confrontation now transformed into something much larger, sharper, and far more dangerous for the future of the British monarchy. It was no longer only a question of whether Camila had been personally rejected by the household. It was a constitutional question about who truly held the ultimate power over royal inheritance when the active ghosts of the past rose up against the present rulers. While Charles struggled to defend Camila with empty words, the real power structure behind the historic decision was already being revealed elsewhere in the palace. The court ruling seemed to carry the full force of constitutional law, but inside the palace walls, everyone understood that the law was only a small part of the entire story. True power had moved quietly through decades of signatures, archive records, and unyielding family loyalty. Charles wore the crown. Yet in this deeply private matter, the crown did not possess the key to open the door. The key belonged to an older form of authority that William understood perfectly before anyone had to explain it to him. The Prince of Wales read the text of the ruling completely alone in his office before meeting his father, and every single line of the document forced him deeper into a structural choice he never wanted to make. Legacy instructions were written directions left by a previous monarch or high household authority, specifically to protect certain royal decisions long after their time on Earth had passed. Household records with internal files that detailed exactly how royal spaces, duties, and physical access had been managed through the generations. Together, these two elements made the Windsor Private Wing far more than a physical location. They transformed it into a protected trust that no living monarch could easily dissolve. The future king knew exactly why a specific role in this crisis mattered for the survival of the institution: royal continuity, which means the smooth and uninterrupted survival of the monarchy from one reign to the next, depended entirely on boundaries that could not be rewritten every single time human emotion or personal convenience demanded it. If Charles could simply change this ancient rule for Camila, then every single guarded instruction left behind by the late Queen could suddenly look temporary and fragile. Every private promise could become negotiable, and every sealed line could be challenged by rank pressure or personal pain. William's jaw tightened as his eyes reached the final page of the legal document. He did not feel even a hint of victory. He felt the immense, freezing burden of appearing completely cold and uncaring to his father when he was simply trying to be historically careful. Any firmness on his part would look like a direct betrayal to Charles. Yet any softness could permanently damage the constitutional structure he would one day inherit as king. That was the absolute cruelty of the historical moment. The prince could protect the long-term future of the monarchy only by allowing his father to suffer a deep, personal humiliation that he could not publicly ease or defend. Meanwhile, Princess had moved through the palace corridors with a different kind of unstoppable force. The Princess Royal spoke with senior courtier in a clipped, controlled, and unmistakable tone, insisting that the court ruling must be respected immediately, without any theatrical punishments or dramatic scenes. A trustee was a person formally assigned to protect and carry out specific instructions, especially when those instructions involve historical property, legacy, or private family arrangements. The new trustees had not preserved the integrity of the wing, so it could become a petty stage for personal revenge against Camila. They had preserved it because Windsor's private spaces were the ultimate symbols of an inherited trust. Catherine noticed what others were far too shaken to talk about openly. Camila's complete exclusion from the wing protected something far more valuable than a mere bureaucratic rule. It protected the living memory of those who had lived, loved, and worked inside that wing long before the new reign ever began. The late Queen's powerful presence still seemed to run through every syllable of the decision, not as an act of anger, but as a final line of maternal care for the family's history. Catherine understood the massive emotional cost of this exclusion, yet she also understood the constitutional warning behind it. Some rooms hold history so deeply that even a golden crown must step back in respect. Once the ruling officially moved from a state of private shock into standard palace procedure, the entire story changed once again. The decision was no longer just words on a page. It became physical movement, redirected access, enforced silence, and permanently altered behavior. The real power behind the door had finally revealed itself, and everyone inside the palace knew that the next emotional wound would not be hidden from the world. The decision had left the courtroom behind, and now Windsor itself began changing around Camila in ways no royal title could ever disguise. Fallout in royal life rarely begins with dramatic shouting. It begins with a subtly changed route, a missing name on a list, or a staff member who looks down at the floor before speaking. For Camila, the new reality arrived in the simplest and most devastating form possible. A door she had fully expected to pass through remained locked, and everyone around her knew exactly why. The cold reality of the physical changes inside Windsor Castle soon hardened into a permanent routine that no amount of royal status or personal frustration could alter. The immediate fallout within the royal household did not manifest as public arguments, but rather through the silent mechanics of palace administration. For Camila, the complete enforcement of the court's decision arrived not through legal language, but through the daily movements of the household staff and the updated security protocols. Her name had been officially and permanently deleted from the active access list connected to the Windsor Private Wing, and that administrative deletion carried far more chilling weight than any hostile public statement could have ever managed. King Charles understood the long-term danger of the situation immediately. The king knew he could not attempt to reverse the updated household procedures without turning a deeply private family humiliation into something far more dangerous to the country, a full-blown constitutional crisis. A constitutional crisis means a severe conflict regarding the legal boundaries, limits, and rules of sovereign authority, while a household crisis represents a total breakdown inside the internal systems and relationships of the palace itself. If Charles chose to abuse his power and push against court's final ruling, he would not simply be defending his wife. He would be actively challenging protected legal records, ancient instructions, and the very foundation that kept Windsor's private world from turning into an open political battlefield. The turning point of this daily reality occurred on quiet afternoon, when Camila reached a familiar historic corridor and paused instinctively. A senior royal aide stepped forward immediately. His voice kept appropriately low and his manner thoroughly careful, and politely redirected her path before she could take another step toward the forbidden rooms. No harsh words were spoken in that quiet hallway, and no one raised a hand in anger. Yet the profound silence surrounding that single professional gesture cut deeper than any open personal insult ever could. The Queen Consort understood the meaning behind every single lowered gaze from the domestic staff. The household employees understood the reality perfectly as well. The court ruling had created a strict new internal map of Windsor, dividing the castle into spaces she could rightfully occupy and spaces she was completely forbidden from entering. Charles watched the entire interaction from several steps away, his face visibly pained and tight with emotion, but he chose not to intervene. That exact moment was when the profound humiliation became entirely complete for the monarch. The King of the United Kingdom saw his own wife stopped and redirected inside his own royal home, and still he remained completely silent because he knew any royal intervention would expose his ultimate defeat to the staff. His personal love urged him to step forward and defend her, but his constitutional duty held him back with an iron grip. And between those two powerful forces, Camila stood entirely alone in the empty space left by his legal powerlessness. Prince William received the official update regarding the security changes later that evening with a controlled, calm expression. The access changes had been successfully completed. The security lists had been legally amended. The daily movement routes had been altered, and the staff had been fully briefed. The Prince of Wales gave only a quiet, firm nod of his head. But that tiny response confirmed that the family had officially crossed from the stage of emotional argument into the era of strict legal enforcement. The court ruling was no longer a painful theoretical decision waiting to be absorbed. It had successfully become a concrete part of their daily reality. Yet, the coldest and most lasting consequence of this legal battle was still waiting to be faced by the family. Locked doors could be redirected, security lists could be rewritten, and staff could follow administrative procedures. But none of those actions could answer the heavy question now pressing against Charles and William regarding what this ruling truly said about loyalty, memory, and the real limits of a modern king. After the doors were locked and the legal language was finalized, the turning point came without any formal palace ceremony or royal advisors. It occurred as Charles and William stood alone in a quiet room, father and son standing on opposite sides of a historic monarchy that neither of them fully controlled or owned. For the first time since the crisis began, the deep humiliation was not discussed as a complex legal matter. It was spoken of as genuine family grief. Charles had requested this private meeting because the court ruling had reached much deeper than Camila's public standing. It had completely exposed his vulnerability as a sovereign ruler. The king had spent his entire life preparing for the ultimate authority of the crown, yet Windsor had now shown him a boundary he could neither charm, command, nor erase through his status. The monarchy had given him a golden crown, but this internal crisis had reminded him that the crown did not own every single memory or room inside its ancient stone walls. That was why the pain felt so deeply personal to him. It was not only Camila being kept outside the wing. It was Charles being told that his own reign did not possess historical power to heal old wounds or rewrite past family decisions. William entered the discussion carefully, knowing that defending the court's decision could easily sound like a cruel condemnation of his father's marriage, and he did not want personal cruelty to hide inside the language of royal duty. But the future king also understood what was truly at stake. If the ruling were challenged for personal reasons, the monarchy's long-term credibility would suffer immensely. Credibility meant the public trust in the integrity of the royal system and the collective belief that its internal rules mattered even when they caused deep personal pain. William had chosen not to fight the court's decision because a future king could not protect the institution by breaking its protected promises. Charles spoke first, his words carrying the heavy weight of total institutional defeat, stating that Windsor had ultimately judged his entire life and choices, not just Camila's legal claim. The sentence hung heavily in the quiet air between them. William did not rush to answer his father, allowing the king's deep hurt to exist without correction because he knew some pain cannot be softened by quick reassurances. Charles had spent decades defending his love in public, and now he faced the terrible reality that his love had won public recognition but not entry into the most sacred family spaces. William finally told him that protecting the late queen's boundaries was not an attack on his kingship. The queen's boundaries meant the late monarch's private limits and the lines she placed around family spaces to guard historical memory and institutional continuity. Charles looked away because the truth was too painful to face directly. He knew his son was right, and that realization made the defeat even harder to bear. The ruling had not been built from personal spite. It had been built from lasting instructions, unyielding loyalty, and a deep belief that some inheritances are emotional rather than purely legal. Charles slowly accepted what he had resisted since the very first page of the ruling crossed his desk. A monarch could open grand ceremonies, approve political appointments, and stand at the absolute center of national life. But he could not force emotional acceptance where memory firmly refused it. William saw the exact moment his father stopped fighting reality. Charles chose total silence over a public legal appeal, and that silence became more powerful than any official statement the palace press office could ever release to the public. It told the household that the ruling would stand forever. It told Camila that the door would remain permanently closed. And it told the British public that something fundamental inside the reign had shifted. By the following morning, the private humiliation had officially become a public symbol, and the nation watched Windsor's closed door speak louder than the palace ever intended. A restrained official statement was released by the press office, acknowledging the ruling and confirming that Windsor household arrangements would strictly follow the court's decision. Household arrangements meant the internal rules that decide exactly who may enter certain spaces and how royal access is handled behind closed palace doors. The careful wording was almost cold, but its meaning was impossible to hide from the media. Camila had lost, Charles had accepted defeat, and Windsor would obey the law. The media quickly seized the silence between those careful words, framing the story as a rare moment where private royal memory completely overpowered present royal rank. Camila read the morning newspaper coverage without speaking a single word, her folded hands in sharp gestures, saying everything her voice did not. Her public humiliation had officially escaped the palace walls, and millions of people now knew that the Windsor Private Wing, the one space she had hoped would mark her final acceptance, had rejected her completely. Charles saw the same brutal headlines and understood the permanent damage to his image. Public sympathy might soften the immediate blow, but it could never erase the powerful image of a reigning king being overruled by the legacy of his own mother. In the end, the historic ruling did not destroy Charles, but exposed the true limits of his modern power. Camila lost a claim to a physical wing, but Charles lost something far more public, the grand illusion that love, rank, and sovereign authority could rewrite every locked room in royal history. The verdict was absolute and final. Windsor had drawn an iron line that no modern crown could cross. Charles remained king, Camila remained Queen Consort, but the private wing remained completely beyond her reach, a final, unmistakable reminder that the British monarchy may forgive, adapt, and endure through the centuries, yet it never forgets the private rooms where its deepest loyalties were originally formed.